Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast, and the official podcast of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. We've just wrapped up the regular school year here at St. Patrick's Seminary and the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music, and we're gearing up for the May 27th start of our summer term of the CISM. We were able to sit down for a moment with Archbishop Cordileone as he joined us for commencement, and I had in mind in this interview asking him some questions that get to the heart of the Church's perspective on sacred music, and what might be especially helpful for Catholics and parishes just beginning the journey of discovering the Church's treasury of sacred music. We hope you enjoy the episode. Archbishop Cordileone, it's a pleasure to be with you, and it's the end of a very long and fruitful year, academic year. It was my first full year here at St. Patrick's Seminary and University, and I saw you with frequency for a number of things that we had here, and I'm really happy to be wrapping up this year with you here, talking about some of the basics of sacred music.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you after this very, as you said, fruitful year with great promise.
So let's start by defining sacred music. And we're going to do that by talking about its purpose. And so sometimes Catholics hear the phrase beauty for beauty's sake, but that's not really a full way of how Catholics consider it. So perhaps we can start by defining what sacred music is by saying what sacred music is for, its purpose.
The music at worship is like all the other elements of worship. It's for a greater end, which is the glory of God and the sanctification of the Christian people. So everything we bring to worship, and most especially the music, which is so formative for people, has to have this in view, the greater glory of God and bringing people closer to God and more perfectly conformed to His Son, Jesus Christ.
And that's an important order, right? That God is first and that we, in worshiping Him, are secondary.
Yes. Well, God has to take the first place. When we put God first place in our life, then everything will fall into place. It's the original sin, right? That man substitutes something else for God, usually himself. That's why there's only one original sin. There hasn't been any other original sin since then, because every sin is a variation of that.
That's good. I hadn't thought of it quite in that pithy way, but that's great. So another common misconception about sacred music is that it's firstly expressive, expressive of my emotions, my faith, my culture, my period in time. And it certainly does have expressive qualities, and we'll get to those in a moment. But I think firstly, we can say that beauty in sacred music is more primarily formative on the human person. Can you explain how sacred music forms us?
Music, it has an intellectual component, right? All the musical elements and the musical theory and the performance and all that, but it also has this intuitive sense. This is why beauty and music especially, which is so powerful at the Mass in particular, has an ability to reach people and bring them into the truth of Christ, because beauty hits us in a way that the other two transcendentals don't, especially that of truth. People have their own ideas, their minds are made up, don't confuse me with the facts, I don't want to hear anyone else's argument. So the mind is closed very often. But when people experience beauty, and again the power of sacred beauty and sacred music, it's undeniable. And people feel a sense of inspiration. Their soul is touched. So this is the beginning of beginning to till the hard soil of the soul to make it fertile for planting the seeds of truth.
Right. And it's something that takes one out of oneself. It's not firstly about just dwelling within oneself, but being drawn to something else. And that something else shapes us in a very fundamental way. I mean, that we're supposed to be conformed to Christ, right?
Yes. So expressive. Okay, so we're living in an age of individualism, and it's the preeminence of the individual, and people have to express themselves in all kinds of different ways. And secular music certainly is expressive, and there's certainly a legitimate form to that. The forms of music, secular music, that where the musician can display is a virtuosity mastery of the medium is very, in a secular context is a good thing and praiseworthy, but sacred music is sacred, not secular. So it's, again, the primary purpose is the glory of God and sanctification of the Christian people. Anything expressive can only be very much secondary and subservient to that primary end.
Right. Well, I think when someone encounters beauty in sacred music, it's a sort of freeing sense of being freed from being limited to one's own self, that you have somehow a path, a bridge to something beyond yourself. And that's seems to be the primarily formative element of it, that it forms through conforming you to Christ.
I appreciate what you say about it draws one out of oneself, right? It's not focused in on oneself. It draws us out with that sense of inspiration and touches us in that way. So it's very formative.
Yeah. So, of course, that drawing out of oneself is firstly formative, and then, secondarily expressive, as we've talked about. So, let's talk about the different things that we usually consider to be expressed in sacred music. So, we often think of emotions, culture, time. We'll get to those in a moment. But can we more properly say that the sacred music is expressive, firstly, of the logos, firstly of God, firstly of the faith?
That's what is meant to express the mysteries of the faith that are incarnated at the Mass. The death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and his incarnation and him drawing us into that mystery. So that is what it's meant to be expressive of. And so certain musical forms have to be adhered to, and then there's different ways of composing within those forms, and sacred music has taken on different manifestations over the centuries. But always what the confining to the form is what you're talking earlier about, a freeing sort of a thing. It's when a composer binds himself to those forms that there's something freeing about it, because then it can become beautiful and in a sacred sense, because it adheres to what sacred music is supposed to be.
Right. So when we talk about emotions being expressed in sacred music, what does that mean in a properly liturgical context? Because, we're there with other people. It's not just about my emotions, although my emotions do matter in a sense. How do we understand that?
Well, we can't park our emotions to the side. You're right. They're always a part of who we are, right? But everything has to be in a liturgical context. And there is an emotional component to worship, especially if we enter into a liturgical type of a spirituality. During the moving ceremonies of Holy Week, there's going to be feeling of a sense of remorse and of not without hope, but a little more kind of somber tone to it. And if we really integrate the spirituality, if we go through Lent, if we're fasting seriously and denying ourselves legitimate pleasures that we enjoy, we feel the difference, especially when it's denying food and we can feel the hunger in our body. It helps us enter more deeply into this kind of liturgical spirituality, sense of repentance, remorse for our sins. And then the jubilation of Easter, the glory of the vigil and the Easter Mass, and returning to a more festive type of a mood. Yes, our emotions are very much a part of that. Likewise, the Advent, Christmas, Epiphany cycle, the silence of Advent is a time for more quiet, some penance to preparing for the gift of God's Son, and certainly that's a season of the year that's jam-packed with emotions. But the emotions we have to try to bring that into this liturgical context if it's going to have an effect on forming us more perfectly into the image of Christ.
We're recording this right now in the seminary, and the seminarians have to go through an intense human formation, and that means really properly ordering the emotions. But this formation is offered to every Catholic through the gift of the sacred liturgy, the givenness of the sacred liturgy, that it really does properly order our emotions, like you're talking about, when we take it into our hearts, that there's a time for mourning, there's a time for rejoicing, there's a time for contemplation. And this is a true gift, I think, that Catholics sometimes miss out on when they are too conformed to their own intensity of the emotion. They miss that freeing capacity of the lived liturgical spirituality.
Yes, and I think everyone wants to make it personalized, but I think when it's personalized, it becomes banal. It's, again, if we adhere to the forms, that's when it becomes great, and we can have that sense of being freed and become more authentically who we are, because it's more authentically who God created us to be.
Yeah. And there's two, the kind of complementarity between silent personal prayer and the liturgical life, that both need to be there. I think about this a lot in terms of liturgical musicians, we spend a lot of time in the liturgy, but our prayer can't be only liturgical. It has to be private. And that's perhaps more that area where the well-formed emotions can be expressed in a more personal and immediate way.
Well, absolutely. We have to put in our time. I sometimes in my confirmation homily speak about the spiritual gym, right? We have to work out spiritually. We have to put in our own time so that when we come together, we can worship well. Just like a sports team, each member of the team has to be working out and then go through the drills together as a team. So we each have to be putting in time for silence, prayer, contemplation, personally, individually, so that precisely we're better formed when we come together. We can give greater glory to God.
Right. So let's talk about another thing that's commonly expressed in music, and that is the issue of the current time, as expressed, I'm thinking, by musical style. Like, people talk about a contemporary style versus older styles or medieval style, or, these kind of broad terms. But what does a properly formed sense of how music expresses in the liturgy express time and style?
Something that's truly beautiful is beautiful in every age, right? It's tested by time, and that's what makes it classic. So, classic beauty can also reflect the age in which it was composed, and we see sacred music has evolved this way. In the East as well, when we had our Sacra Liturgia conference, the talk by the Greek bishop, my friend Metropolitan Gerasimos, he had recordings of Byzantine chant. It was very interesting because the early chants were very Semitic. Of course, the chants came from the synagogue. But then he played more recent compositions. You could clearly detect, even to us non-professional musicians, the elements of Western music theory, but it's still clearly Byzantine chant. So it keeps that form. And same thing has happened in the West until recently. The Gregorian chant then become more complex chant compositions, and then that morphs into polyphony. So that's why with my Benedict XVI Institute, we're commissioning new masses of sacred music that reflect contemporary themes, but it's in keeping with the continuity of the tradition, incorporating themes of the time. So the first one, the Mass of the Americas, is the primary example of how that twin tribute to Our Lady of Guadalupe, Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception, is sacred music that incorporates the popular songs the Mexican people sing to honor Our Lady of Guadalupe. So those sounds, the textures are woven throughout, even the popular melody of the Himno Guadalupano. That melody is kind of woven in and out, sometimes more identifiable, sometimes more subtly. So Frank LaRocca made this masterpiece of doing precisely this, something within the tradition that has that quality of classical beauty that's beautiful in every age, in every culture, but also reflects the time and culture in which we are living.
I mean, and the sacred time is one in which we enter into the eternal now of God, and that encompasses all things. So I always find it a lovely compliment to have the chant next to Renaissance polyphony, next to modern compositions, or a Baroque thing, because it draws together the fullness of the church's experience. It's not just in our time.
They complement each other, certainly, and people don't have a problem with that when it comes to secular classical music, right? The great orchestras of the world still play the great symphonies of Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms, and there are new compositions. Some maybe not too in keeping with the tradition, but many that are. They're new. There's something new about them, but they're still in the classical mode. So, And people enjoy listening to the full spectrum of that music. And so the full spectrum of sacred music can serve well our prayer, our worship of God, because they complement each other.
Yeah, and this is primarily what Pius X is talking about when he says Gregorian chant is the supreme model of sacred music. He doesn't mean it's the only Western music. This is a uniquely Western thing, that it has a whole range of legitimate diversity that's really wonderful and spectacular. But they sound in harmony and keeping with each other in the spiritual sense, even if their styles are different and reflective of different times.
Yes.
So let's chat about culture being expressed in sacred music. You talked a little bit about that. I'm wondering if you could also talk about the issue of language as it meets culture, and what do you see as a really thinking with the mind of the church about the use of vernacular languages versus Latin, and the use of specific cultural idioms versus a more universalized culture of the church?
I'm always thinking of my experience in Nigeria, the people there sing Gregorian chants, and sometimes more complex chants. And, in all the parts of the Mass, even the Credo, they sing them in Latin. And the bishop I was visiting and was taking me around, we probably said, we do things the Roman way. So they sang these beautiful, complex Gregorian chants. They also sang hymns in English, classic English hymns, but kind of with an African beat to it. But so it was, I think, a happy harmonization of the two. And then they sang some songs in their indigenous language with the stronger kind of the African beat. But it was all in a way that was appropriate and balanced out. So there was room for all of that. And this is what the Second Vatican Council called for, right? It said that Latin is to remain the language of the Roman Rite, which makes perfect sense. Latin is universal. And that's why Paul VI wanted us learning those chants in the Jubilato Deo hymnal. So the whole Catholic world could sing the Mass together in Latin. You could go anywhere in the world and pray the Mass with the people there, because all Catholics are supposed to know these hymns and parts of the Mass in Latin. But then there's room for vernacular as well, vernacular compositions of music and certain propers of the Mass as well to be proclaimed in the vernacular. So there's room for all of that. And again, new compositions of sacred music can incorporate elements of the popular music in the culture. That's totally different from just taking that music and plugging it down into the Mass, right? That's not what enculturation is. I'll never forget when the bishops go for their every few years ad limina visit to Rome and meet with the different dicasteries and audience with Holy Father. When we met the Congregation for Divine Worship, and Cardinal Sarah was the prefect, we got on that topic. He just kind of had his head down and was silent as everyone was droning on and on about enculturation. And then there was a pause, and then he lifted his head, and as if it was an oracle from the prophet, he said, enculturation isn't introducing whatever is in the popular culture into the liturgy. It's introducing Christ into the culture. And when Christ is introduced in the culture, everything changes. Everything changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Then he put his head back down, and we were all silent. So enculturation, so we can adapt those elements. I gave the example of the Mass of the Americas. When I was trying to explain to Frank LaRocca what I had envisioned with this Mass, I gave him an example with so music is a sense of sound, architecture is a sense of sight, and that enculturation, I gave an example of the mission church. So when the Franciscans came here to California, and they wanted to evangelize the indigenous population, they didn't say Mass in camps, like where the people lived, or in huts. They built churches. They built churches that are traditional Catholic churches, but they reflect this time and place in this part of the world. The materials that are used, obviously they had to use the adobe that's here, the soil here, but also kind of the colors and this whole style of architecture that is now a very popular style of architecture here in the West and the Southwest. Secular buildings use the mission church art. So that's how the church transforms the culture.
Right. I'm so reminded of the current times search for identity. And this is a Catholic way of approaching it, that one doesn't have to deny one's own language, one's own time, one's own place, one's own background. But those things are subsumed into a path which conforms one to Christ. If we accept firstly that formational aspect of sacred music, then there's a great freedom in the expressivity of our individual living out of it in a way that's not closed in on oneself, but that really always has contact with God. This is truly a liturgical spirituality.
It opens us up to something much greater. We think about what are the elements that form a culture. There are the arts, literature, the stories and the lore, the food, and language too. Language is a fundamental formative factor in a culture, and we have a language in our Catholic culture. Well, Latin is our language, it's our common language, so it should be a part of any Catholic's life. But also in a metaphorical sense, it's the sacramental language, right? We speak through signs and symbols, and we need to enhance those as much as we can, because our church has always understood that one teaches more powerfully with symbols than with words.
Right. So the church has a culture of its own, and there's a particular modality of that in the Roman Rite. But all of this is expressive of fundamentally the incarnation, that there are elements which are visible, tangible, but always united to God.
Yes.
In a trajectory towards Him. So could we just describe, if you had to put into your own words, each of the qualities that Pius X talks about, in terms of what's necessary in sacred music to accomplish these goals and have these effects? Of course, he's talking about holiness, beauty, or goodness of forms, and universality. How would you put each of those into your own words?
Well, holiness has something of an other world to it, right? But not arcane, indecipherable, but something that's not mundane, something that's not of our everyday life. So there's a certain sense that this belongs to another world, but a world to which I can have access through this form. I would look at holiness that way.
Great. And how would you describe beauty? And perhaps we could take this from the moniker or the epithet that everyone always uses: beauty is in the eye of the beholder. What do you think about that as a Catholic archbishop?
There are limits to that. Right? Beauty, there's a goodness of form and a consistency of form. That's, again, beauty, everyone can recognize beauty, but it's not completely subjective. Again, there's a certain form that has to be adhered to, and when that form is adhered to, then there's the possibility for creativity, right? There's de gustibus. Within the forms, people can prefer what some people might prefer Renaissance polyphony, and other people might prefer classic hymnody. But these are each in those styles of music, they're adhering to a certain form of composition. So within that, yes, there's room for people having their personal preferences. But when it comes to liturgy, though, it's not personal preference that's to prevail. It's what fits the liturgical action, and so the sacredness of the action, and then the sense of the liturgical time, what's going on, and then with the emotions and all that. If it's a penitential season, or it's something at Easter, so the music likewise should reflect that.
Right. And let's get to the final one: universality.
Well, as I was saying, beauty, if it's truly beautiful, it's beautiful in every age and in every culture. It's just immediately recognizable. People don't even need to understand the words to recognize that it's beautiful. I remember way back when I was doing studies, and I used to attend liturgy once in a while at the Rusicum, and someone gave me this is so long ago, was a cassette tape, not even a CD, let alone was something you download, but of the Easter liturgy. And I just listened to those chants. I can't understand Russian. Most importantly was about it. but I listen to it over and over because it's just so beautiful, right? So there's something that connects with us at a deep level, and again, beautiful in every culture.
Do you think there's a way in which there are some things that really have a sort of spectacular beauty that makes them immediately recognizable in a more universal way, and perhaps there are other things that are a little bit more subtle that might take an acclimatization and a spending time within a particular style? I think of, for example, there are some people who have a very immediate reaction to the beauty of Gregorian chant sung well, and yet there's a deepening of that can occur, or maybe even work on someone who doesn't have, has maybe an ideological opposition in their heart to the Gregorian chant, that if they continue to expose themselves to it, there's a softening of heart that can break through in that process of spending time with beautiful things.
Oh, yes. Spending time with beautiful things, I think, sensitizes us to beauty. I think in this day and age, we maybe need to teach people how to appreciate beauty, because there's less of a sense of appreciation of that. So spending time with it certainly will do that.
And let's finish by talking a little bit about active participation. Really, there are two kinds of participation that we could kind of broadly characterize as belonging to active participation, interior and exterior. Could you talk about each of those and maybe how they interrelate?
I love this question. The participatio actuosa, not activa, actuosa. People more like a sense of being engaged in the liturgy. Not everyone doing everything, or some people doing something all the time. So there's active participation in the sense of, yes, participating in the prayers and in the chants, in that sense of being active participation. But there's also active listening, right? This is, so there's, and the council in Sacrosanctum Concilio pretty much says, even if implicitly, that there's room for choral music, right? Right where it says that encourages people to learn the Gregorian chants in Latin so they can sing them together, and that's to be the first place. Gregorian chants have the first place. It says there are other forms of music that can be developed as long as they adhere to the liturgical action, and it mentions specifically polyphony. A parish congregation is not going to be able to learn polyphonic music, right? So it has to be choral. The choir is singing it. So the council says there is a place for choral music where people listen, but it's not performance, right? It's prayer. That's why Pius X was trying to get us away from as beautiful as these orchestrated masses are, it's performance. But there's this prayer. It's prayer, but we're listening. That's active listening, right? As I say, if listening were not something that were active but purely passive, we'd have to do away with lectors and everyone read the readings at Mass together.
Or even the celebrants parts.
Yeah, and yes. If that's so we need that right balance, right, between the act of listening and the act of participating in singing those parts of the Mass.
And there are really two roles for the choir at Mass. It's firstly, yes, to support the singing of the congregation, but also to render the Church's treasury of sacred music that is unrenderable. And, this second role of the choir, when it's, muted or negated as a legitimate role of the choir, we tend to overactivate people in their spirituality. And it seems to me that in our time, a cultivation of the ability to be silent before God is a supreme spiritual need. And this other role of the choir, besides just supporting the singing of the congregation, is absolutely essential for the spirituality of the modern person.
Our culture is so uncomfortable with stillness, contemplation, and silence. Yeah, just that ability to savor the presence of God, which this treasury helps us to do. This is one of the greatest assets we have in evangelizing in our age, of this very hyper-secularized age, is the beauty of this treasury. So we should make it prominent, not keep it buried in the ground, right? So many young people who go to these liturgy conferences, I've heard say, when they grow up with the popular songs, right? They had no exposure to any chant or sacred music. And then when they discover it, and how beautiful it is, they say, this is what they say: I've been deprived of my Catholic birthright. This is our birthright as Catholics. Let us be proud of it, and let us use it, let us sing it, and let it transform us and evangelize the world.
Yeah. You know, if I might make a additional, more pointed point, this is something that, when we talk about something like the introit, the Second Vatican Council, especially in Musicam Sacram and Sacrosanctum Concilium, envisioned, composers composing things perhaps that could involve the congregation singing at the introit. But that is a sort of novelty. And a composer has to have a real skill in order to make that actually something that can function in accordance with the spirit of the liturgy, which is the movement of the heart and watching the procession go up to the altar. That's a challenging thing, to compose music which does that. And so maybe a composer is up to that challenge. But the Second Vatican Council also envisioned the maintenance of the Gregorian introit, which is not primarily a congregational chant. So, even when it's translated into English, maybe that's a step towards the Gregorian introit. It doesn't have to be sung by the congregation. It's fine for it to be sung by a choir, to allow the participation of the heart to accompany that movement.
Oh, yeah, certainly. And I think there are different ways to balance this out. One could be a refrain that the people can sing, and then the choir could sing a verse that's more musically complex. Or what I prefer is how we do it at our cathedral. I love the classical hymns, but hymns really don't have a place per se in the Mass. In the Roman liturgy, hymns are proper to the divine office. We sing hymns, as you know, it goes back to Pius XII, in order, again, to encourage its active participation, allowed people before Vatican II to sing hymns in the vernacular at low Mass. So that's just become our standard practice. But those hymns, many of them are quite beautiful and moving. So of course, it's a long procession for us to get up to the sanctuary in our cathedral, so the people sing a hymn, and then when the liturgical procession reaches toward the sanctuary, the choir transitions into the sung introit, usually in Latin. So the choir is singing the introit proper, only the choir sings, but it's sort of like a preparatory hymn that people sing together.
It's similar to what the main role of the organ was, which was to accompany processions with instrumental music.
Good point, yes.
And so, we're going to entitle this episode, What is Sacred Music and Why Does It Matter? So we talked a lot about what is sacred music. Could you just sum up, if you had to say to someone who maybe doesn't really feel like sacred music matters, or that it's something that we should be talking about or spending time and money on, what would you say? Why does it matter?
The whole point of our life in this world is to get us ready for heaven. We have to be capable of the life of heaven. Sacred music is one of the key ways that we're able to do that, because that beauty opens up our heart to the beauty of God, and we want to spend time with God. That helps to get us ready for heaven. That's the only reason for living in this world, is to get ready to go to heaven.
Thank you. That's a great summary of the whole of the Christian life and sacred music. Thank you so much, Archbishop.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G Major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.